When the Commodore 64 hit the home computer market in 1982, it had more going for it than copious memory, slick graphics, and a killer price point. It featured a sound chip so sophisticated that it would have been worthy of featuring in a dedicated musical instrument. And there's a good reason for that. A musical instrument is exactly what its SID sound processor was originally designed for, and it was really just a quirk of business circumstance that the chip ended up bundled with a home computer. The fact that it did helped the C64 power some of the best-sounding games of its generation, but having a killer sound chip doesn't in itself lead to killer sound, as many of its earlier titles showed. With great audio power comes great audio programming responsibility. The Commodore 64 was calling out for a new breed of audio programmers, ones as talented in sound design and musical composition as they were in high-performance machine code programming. And one of the notable few to answer that call was British freelancer Rob Hubbard. As a musical loan-in for game developers through the 1980s, Rob scored dozens of the most memorable and accomplished soundtracks of the Commodore's games catalog. And today, we're going to see how he did it. In this video, I'll be lifting the lid on Rob's original music player and showing the inner workings of the sound code that powered the vast majority of his earlier game music. But also, I'm going to start recreating it. This is the fourth episode of a series in which I'm porting Rob's music for the game Commando to play on the arcade hardware of the original game it's based on. By the end of this video, I will finally be able to show the arcade hardware playing Rob's original music data. To set your expectations, this will be a first pass, a simple player compatible with the basic structure of Rob's songs that I'll be updating in future to flesh out the sound. But it will, with some fidelity, play all three songs from Commando start to finish, as well as maybe a few tunes from some other games. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In March of 1993, the online newsletter C Hacking, that's C as in Commodore, featured an annotated disassembly of Rob's music player, reverse-engineered by then-grad student Anthony McSweeney. This code is specifically for the 1985 platformer Monty on the Run, but it needs very little modification to play Rob's Commando tunes, and from my probing around is compatible with the fundamentals of at least 30 of Rob's early Commodore 64 works. Now, Rob's player wasn't a drop-in fixed block of code. As a freelancer, he would have tailored each project to the specific needs of each client. Different games would have imposed different constraints on memory, performance, and sound resources, but the fundamentals of the player were largely the same from one project to the next, and although it grew progressively more sophisticated as time went on, the underlying paradigm was still there. What I'm going to be introducing today is specifically how the player was configured for Commando, though I'll have a few things to say this time and next about its evolution and the differences between games. Anyway, my strategy for rewriting the player is to first build a sequencer for just a few notes, and then to work outwards to string those sequences together, play them on multiple voices, and give them character. But crucially, I don't want to be doing any editorializing of the music. I'll need to write some scripts to relocate it to fit into the arcade's memory layout, but ultimately, what I'm going to be playing will be Rob's original data and not my own rearrangement of it. So, how does Rob's data format work? Let me say from the start that if you're familiar with soundtracker modules, that musical staple of the 16-bit generation, then try to cast them out of your mind, because these are not those. Rob's C64 modules are more complex, much more space efficient, and just a completely different paradigm. So try to let go of any preconceptions, and let's start at the basics. At the center of the modules is a numbered data structure that we shall call a pattern. A pattern is a musical phrase like this one, or this one, or this one. Patterns can be completely silent, they can be short, and they can be long. But to get to the very heart of it, what a pattern represents is all of the notes played on one SID voice for some period of time, and that period of time is not a standard length prescribed by the format. It's however long that particular pattern needs to play that specific musical phrase. So, with the various patterns serving as a musical phrasebook, it's time to start building some sentences. To do that, let me introduce a construct that we're going to call a track. A track is essentially a playlist of patterns. It can draw from any of the repertoire of patterns in the module any number of times, laying each one down just by listing its pattern number. This indirect referencing scheme is key to how Rob's modules are so space efficient. A baseline, for example, could repeat over and over, but the memory cost would just be a single byte per loop. And in fact, because pattern lengths are arbitrary, they can even be used for just a few notes within a single measure, as you'll see here in Thing on a Spring. So, a track then lays down the entire sequence of patterns for one voice for the whole duration of a song. And that means that the definition of a song is just a collection of 3 tracks, each one playing concurrently on a different SID voice. And when I say concurrently, I mean completely independently. You'll notice from looking at the timing here that across voices, the patterns don't have common start and end points. You might see the hint of an underlying grid structure, but that is a feature of the composition, not something imposed by the format. Behind the scenes, the Commodore 64 is just running the same track playing code 3 times over, each iteration using different state variables, reading from different input data, and writing to different SID registers. In fact, the tracks are so independent from each other that if they had different lengths, then on each loop of the song, they'd drift increasingly out of sync with each other. And in my memory, that actually happened in one version of one of Rob's songs. I think it was The Human Race, but I can't find any evidence of that now. Anyway, that is the top-level view. To summarize, a song is 3 parallel tracks. A track is a sequence of patterns, and a pattern is a sequence of notes. It's time now to take a look inside the patterns and see how those notes are coded. These are the opening patterns for Commando's main melody, and if I peel back the abstraction to show the data underneath, I can show you the bytes getting consumed note by note. I'm just going to let this play out for a bit, and while you're watching it, you might make a few observations. First, that the bytes are getting consumed at an uneven rate. These aren't like soundtracker modules where each unit of time gets a fixed number of bytes. We just don't have the memory for that. Second, that the bytes are somehow telling the player to switch in and out of different instruments and effects. And third, that you're seeing anywhere from 1 to 3 bytes highlighted at any given time. In reality, up to 4 bytes are consumed when playing each note of the pattern. So, let's look into what they do. I'm going to label these bytes byte 1, byte 2, byte 3, and byte 4. And just to be clear about naming, those labels refer specifically to the purpose of each byte, not its position in the stream. So for example, if the note were to not feature a byte 2 or byte 3, then it would only be 2 bytes long, and those bytes would be a byte 1, followed in the stream by a byte 4. With that said, let's introduce them. In broad terms, byte 1 represents the length and the type of the note, and is always present. Byte 2, on the other hand, is usually omitted. I'm going to loosely call it effects for now, but it's a big topic that we'll dive into next time. Byte 3 represents the pitch of the note and is usually present, and byte 4 is a look ahead to what's coming next. As we progress, I'll dive into every detail of every byte, but I want to turn my attention now to the implementation and try to get at least a basic pattern playing on the arcade platform. So here's the plan. Last time, I got a proof of concept running on the arcade hardware that played a single note at a chosen pitch. What I want to do now is modify that code so that instead of stopping the note when it's done, it just changes its pitch to that of the next note in the pattern. And so, for the sake of getting something up and running quickly, I found a pattern that should be particularly easy to parse and play back. And that pattern is Monty on the Run's pattern 15, played right at the end of its main song's melody. By the way, 20-something years ago, I had the very good fortune to hear that pattern being performed live on stage by the mad fiddler Mark Knight. Furiously quick piece, Mark plays the whole piece on an electric violin flawlessly, backed by Danish band Press Play on Tape. If you weren't there, it was truly something special. If you were, then my rendition might disappoint a little. Anyway, there's a few reasons why I chose this particular pattern. First, it's nice and long, nearly 1/4 kilobyte in size and over 120 notes, meaning the notes give each other lots of context, which will help me tell if something's sounding off. Second, I won't need to handle notes having a variable number of bytes. Until the very end, all of its notes are 2 bytes long, with every even index byte being a byte 1, the type and timing byte, and every odd index byte being a byte 3, which is the pitch byte. My last reason for choosing this pattern is that I won't need to read rhythm. Until the very end, all of the byte 1s have the same value, meaning the notes all last as long as each other. So to play the pattern, I can just periodically update the sound hardware's pitch value based on those byte 3s until I get to the end, which is something we haven't talked about yet. So let me introduce byte 4. The last byte of the potentially 4 bytes that get read per note isn't actually a part of the note itself. Instead, it's either the next note in the pattern, that is to say, it's byte 1, or it's a signal that the pattern is ending, which is a byte whose bits are all 1s. Later on, that'll mean switching to the next pattern of the track, but for now, when I encounter it, I'll just silence the hardware and my program will be done. So, in summary, all my code will have to do will be to stream through those byte 3 pitch values. But you might remember from previous videos that a SID frequency is a 2-byte value. So, what's going on here? In reality, what's hosted in byte 3 isn't itself a SID frequency. Rather, it holds a 7-bit frequency index, which is a value you'd need to look up in a separate frequencies table to get the 2 bytes that you can plug into the SID. Theoretically, this frequency table could be stripped down to only those notes that feature in the songs, but in practice, the frequency tables in Rob's modules provide 1 row for each piano key, whether it's used by a song or not. That turns out to be a useful feature for some of the effects, which we'll get to later. But right now, let's get the Mac out. It's time to get coding. Okay, what you're seeing here is essentially the same demo that you saw last episode that plays a single note, only this time I'm pulling a pitch value from byte 3 of a pattern. I'm looking up that value in a frequency table to get a SID frequency, which I'm then sending through the divider to turn into an SSG-compatible wavelength. I'm sending that value out to the audio hardware, and then waiting 20 interrupts before doing the whole thing again. And I'm going to keep on looping until I finally hit that FF pattern terminator, at which point I'm going to silence the audio hardware and stop the demo. Okay, let's give that a listen. I think this project's starting to feel a little more real now. We have the virtual hardware for the first time actually sounding a little Hubbardy. Sure, it doesn't have the rich texture of the C64 original, nor the artistic flair of Mark Knight's rendition, but we have a bass line. We have notes, they're at the right pitch, and it's going to sound okay so long as those notes all have the same length. So if I slow it down, it should be able to play this other pattern from Master of Magic. But honestly, that's about it. If I try feed it a pattern that actually has some rhythm to it, like this one from Thing on a Spring, then things start to break down. And if I try use a pattern that has a variable number of bytes per note, then all bets are off. This one is the main tune from Commando, but you'd never know it. Yeah, to fix this, we're going to need to understand the mysteries of byte 1. Byte 1 is present in every note, and it's divided into a lower part, which reveals the note's length, and an upper part, which contains flags that determine what type of a note it is. Crucially, these flags decide whether bytes 2 and 3 make an appearance, so it's vital to honor those, or, as you just heard, the whole player flies off the rails. But I want to focus first on the note length in the least significant 5-bit. I'm going to call the unit of time that the note lengths are measured in a song tick, and I'll state that the number of song ticks that a note lasts for is whatever value is in the length bits plus 1. So the shortest note that the format would allow would have a value 0, meaning it lasts for 1 song tick, and the longest, since this is a 5-bit field, would have a value of 31, which would be a note that lasts for 32 song ticks. But how long is a song tick? That depends on the song. Typically, Rob's music player is called from an interrupt that's downstream from the video timing. So each video frame, the player will do some amount of work, but only some of those frames will be song ticks. In the case of Commando's main tune, 1 song tick occurs every 3 video frames. But for the high score tune, a song tick occurs every 4 video frames. And for Monty on the Run, to give one other example, a song tick occurs every 2. Later versions of Rob's player allow for a fractional length by inserting extra frames into some of the song ticks, but Commando predates that. This relationship between song ticks and video frames is something that, going forward, I'm going to call timescale. In McSweeney's original disassembly, he refers to the concept as speed, but I think that's misleading for a couple of reasons. For one, it's really the opposite of speed. The bigger the number, the more frames between song ticks, so the slower the playback. But also, what motivated Rob's choice of timescale wouldn't just have been the tempo of the song. There's also the question of granularity. It doesn't matter if the song has a low beats per minute, what matters is the duration of its shortest note. But even then, it's not so simple. Generally, musical note durations work in powers of 2, so you'd expect all of the longer notes to be some multiple of the shortest. But that's not always the case. This rhythm, for example, is known as a triplet, and it's where 3 notes would be played in the time of 2. To play a triplet correctly, you'd need to base your song around a timing unit fine enough that both triplets and the regular notes are multiples of it, even if no single note would ever be just 1 unit long. You might recognize triplets from the soundtrack to this classic 1983 Atari game, apparently based on some 6-year-old movie. A remake of a Kurosawa film, I'm told. Anyway, contrast that to an implementation whose time unit presumably didn't account for triplets, and you'll hear that many of its notes are being snapped to the wrong grid. So that's granularity. There's actually one other consideration that factors into the choice of timescale, and that's articulation, which we'll deal with in a second. But right now, we know enough about note lengths to at least play them at the correct times. For each song in a module, there's a byte of data that tells us the timescale it should be played at. And I can tell you that the length of a song tick is that number plus 1. And knowing that, we can finally go from a note length, as recorded in byte 1, to the number of video frames that note should be held for. Having said that, I want to move away from referring to video frames from here on, because we'll be playing this music back on arcade hardware, which uses completely different video timing from a PAL Commodore 64, and things could get confusing. So I'm going to borrow some terminology from the field of emulation. With emulators, you have a host machine, which is the one doing the emulating, and a target machine, which is the one being emulated. And in that framework, the arcade hardware would be the host, and the Commodore 64 music player would be the target. As we saw last time, the sole source of timing for the arcade hardware is an interrupt going into the sound CPU. So that time interval I'm going to call a host tick from now on. From that, I'll have to fashion a timeline corresponding to a C64 video frame, and that I'll call a target tick. And finally, some arbitrary multiple of those will make the song tick that we've just been discussing. So that's the terminology solved. Next up is the mechanics of it, and the question of how I'm going to distribute the target ticks among the host ticks. But before that, I need to say a few quick things about the numbers. Last time, I measured the host tick to fire at exactly 240 Hz, and I was kind of puzzled at how a timing signal that's clearly a function of the video frame rate could run at such a weird multiple of it. Well, thanks to some folks in the comments section, I now have the answer. It turns out that even though MAME will not run without a dump of that timing prom, it doesn't actually use it, grumble, 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 and instead creates a built-in timer firing at exactly 240 Hz. On real hardware, the host tick fires exactly 4 times per video frame, which is around 238.5 Hz. Second, let's talk about that target tick. There were 2 versions of the Commodore 64 game back in the day. The original code was written for PAL machines running at a 50 Hz frame rate, so that's the timing I'm going to recreate for this project. But there was a port to NTSC machines that basically just ran the whole thing at 60. My first experience of this game was the PAL version, and to me, the NTSC one plays and sounds comically quick. But when I was showing this project off at the SoCal Vintage Computer Festival, I made a point of asking people, if their first experience of this game was the NTSC one, did it seem too fast to them at the time? And the overwhelming consensus was no. If the 60 Hz version is what you first played, then almost certainly that's going to be what feels right to you. So for this project, I will at least make that an option. And that shouldn't be hard. For NTSC Commodore 64s, the frequency of the target tick is near enough an exact multiple of the host tick, since they're both pretty much 60 Hz video. But for PAL Commodore 64s, the multiple is around 4.76. So how am I going to achieve a weird division like that? Here's a random question. Did you ever see the very first Mario Brothers game? No, it wasn't that one. It wasn't that one either. Donkey Kong had the first appearance of Mario, but the first game to give him a sibling was the Mario Brothers Game & Watch from 1983. In this one, the brothers have to load up a truck by pulling crates off a conveyor belt and feeding them through a production line. To do that, Mario and Luigi can be moved up and down to catch the crates and move them along. You're wondering where I'm going with this. Bear with me. Once the truck is laden with 8 crates, it'll ship them out, and crucially, all of the crates already in the pipeline at that point will remain in place, ready to be loaded onto the next truck. Rinse and repeat, and that's the game. Now, ask yourself this question. How frequently does that truck dispatch? In any given time frame, it's going to average out to the number of crates that roll off the conveyor belt divided by the capacity of the truck. And we can use that to precisely divvy up the timing intervals. Suppose that our truck had a capacity of 138 crates, and that every host tick, the brothers load it with another 29. When the truck gets full, we'll consider this host tick to also be a target tick. We'll dispatch the truck and move the excess crates onto the next one. Keep doing that, and the target ticks are going to fire roughly once every 4.76 host ticks, which is what we wanted. In fact, with this pair of numbers, we're only 0.01% away from the target. Pretty good for a 1-byte counter. And for what it's worth, if this were an NTSC truck, it'd need a capacity of 199, onto which the brothers would be loading 50 at a time. So here is demo 2. It's the same as what you saw last time, except now in the interrupt handler, I'm dividing the host ticks into target ticks and the target ticks into song ticks. And I'm extracting the length bits from byte 1 of a note and using that to reset the countdown for the note instead of using a constant like we did last time. So here it is playing that same pattern from Thing on a Spring that was causing problems last time. It's better, but it's not right. The pattern is at least lasting for the right duration now, but when it features the same note many times in a row, they're just blending into each other to become one very long note, which is what you'd expect, because right now the square wave generator is playing at full volume the whole time. All I'm doing is updating its pitch in response to the new notes in the stream. But implicit in Rob's data format is a gap between notes. Ordinarily, his player would release a note exactly one song tick before its duration is up. For example, if a note's length bits have the value 3, then it'll occupy 4 song ticks. But more specifically, the player will press the virtual piano key down at the start, leave it held for 3 song ticks, then release it and leave it up for the remaining 1. That gap between the notes allows each one to be individually articulated, and because the key off lasts for 1 song tick, then, well, this is the other consideration for the song's timescale. The bigger the timescale, the more pronounced the gap between notes. There is a little more to say about articulation though, and that finally gives me a chance to talk about those flags in byte 1. Bit 5 is a no-release flag. If the player sees this bit set, then instead of keying off the note 1 song tick before the end, it'll leave it held. There's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. One would be a musical slur, which is when there's no gap between the outgoing note and an incoming one. Imagine playing the violin, which I can't, and during a single bow stroke, changing finger positions. To get an idea of how that's different, take a listen to Action Biker, one of Rob's earliest and simplest pieces. To show the contrast, here's a modified version of the in-game tune, where I've stripped the no-release flags out of one of the patterns. You'll notice that each note stands out quite prominently, and it's really quite punchy. If I put the no-release flags back in now, you'll hear the tune as it was meant to be heard, and hopefully notice the effect of the slurs. It's subtle, but it makes for a much breezier piece, a little closer in mood to the chill vibes of the game's title music, which uses the no-release flag to help recreate kind of a Hawaiian style. And, well, somebody's got to say it. It's an odd choice of theming for a motorcycle stunt game. Anyway, the other use for the no-release flag is a musical tie. A tie is a special case of the slur where the incoming note has the same pitch that the outgoing note did. The reason you'd want to do that will be to play really long notes. You'll remember that a note's longest expressible duration is 32 song ticks, and depending on the timescale, that'd be maybe 1.5 seconds to 3 seconds long. To play continuously past that limit, you'd need to stitch 2 notes together by setting no release on the first. Once you've done that, you could achieve a tie by giving the second the same pitch value, but there's a better way. Let me introduce you to bit 6, which is the append flag. If the append flag is set, then this note won't feature a pitch byte. Instead, all we're doing is giving extra time to the end of the previous note. This could mean one of two things. Ordinarily, the previous note would have keyed off one song tick before its length is up. So if the note that follows it has its append flag raised, then we'll just be extending the silence, and this is how Rob's player achieves a musical rest. But if the previous note had its no release flag set, then the key off would never have happened, meaning that the append would be extending the note itself, and what we have is a musical tie. That leaves just one remaining flag for byte 1, which is bit 7, a flag that determines whether this note has a byte 2. Byte 2 is the special source of Rob's music. It's the difference between the abstract digital sheet music that we've seen so far and that magical wobbly-hubbly sound that memories are made of. Honestly, back in the day, it sometimes felt like the music was what you were paying for. The game itself was the breakfast cereal you had to eat through just to get the free toy. There'll be a lot to say about Byte 2 in the next episode, but the good news is that we don't really need it right now. As long as I at least consume Byte 2 from the stream when it appears, then I should be able to play any pattern from any of Commando's songs, as well as pretty much any of Rob's early catalogue. So let's put that to the test. I've updated the last demo to switch the channel volume on and off according to the implicit articulation and the flags in byte 1. I'm also now always reading the correct number of bytes per note, so with a caveat, this demo should be compatible with pretty much anything. So here's the caveat. Sometimes I can get away with ignoring what's in byte 2, and sometimes I can't. For things like slide notes, if you didn't know they were supposed to be there, you probably wouldn't guess that anything was wrong. The bigger problems are where ignoring byte 2 leads to discordance. Take, for example, Rob's signature bass dive effect. Without honoring byte 2, you're only going to hear the first frequency of it, and that one's very unlikely to be in the correct key. But the more serious problem is going to be the noise waveform. That one's used all over the place for percussion, and our player doesn't know about it. So it's going to play a noise pitch as a square wave pitch, and trust me, that one's going to be intolerable. Take a listen to the bass line from Commando's high score tune as it's meant to be heard. And here's how it's going to sound on a player that doesn't know about noise. It's a big problem, but I kind of have my hands tied on that one until the next episode. For now, we have a pattern player that will at least parse anything. Let's now turn it into a track player. I mentioned earlier that track data is a list of pattern numbers with 1 byte per entry. So when Commando's melody track starts with the byte 19, then we have to play pattern 19. But how? Jumbled into the giant stew that is memory are the note sequences for all the patterns, and they really could be anywhere within it, potentially interspersed with code, variables, and random other data. So Rob uses a table in memory to associate pattern numbers with their start addresses. In practice, it's 2 tables, one for the high bytes and one for the low, but conceptually, they serve as 1. To play pattern 19 then, we would look up entry 19 and feed whatever address that gave us to our pattern player from demo 3. That pattern player is going to stream continuous notes from that byte up until the FF pattern terminator, at which point the pattern is done and it's up to the track player to advance to its next byte, and on it goes. So the fact that we have a pattern pointers table allows repeated patterns in a song to be reduced to just a single byte per loop. But there's another marginal benefit on top of that. Take a listen to pattern 33 from Crazy Comets. There are 4 occasions where this pattern occurs in the soundtrack. One of those is after pattern 32. And the other 3 are after the super short pattern 8. And crucially, the composition has it that whenever you hear that pattern 8, it's always followed by pattern 33, which affords Rob a little trick. By placing pattern 33 immediately after pattern 8 in memory and not terminating pattern 8 with an FF byte, he's arranged it so that pattern 8 will fall through into pattern 33 without it needing an additional entry in the track. You could think of this as a short pattern 8 falling through into pattern 33. Or you could think of it as a long pattern 8 with pattern 33 serving as a pattern within a pattern. Either way, it's a neat little trick, and not one that Rob uses very much, though I will note that the main song from Zoids does feature a pattern within a pattern within a pattern. Like I said, these are not soundtracker modules. These are the kind of tricks that you pull when every byte counts and you're scoring music by hand in hex. For my conversion, I'll need to at least check for patterns within patterns so that I don't duplicate bytes when extracting data. However, we're not done with the track player yet. Up to now, I've presented track data as being a list of pattern numbers, but what it really is a list of commands, where the low-numbered bytes mean play the corresponding pattern. The high-numbered bytes are used at the end of the track to tell the player what to do next. FF in hex is an instruction to immediately loop the track back to the start, and this one's used by Commando to endlessly repeat the main song and the high score music. FE is an instruction to immediately halt playback, which we'll need to support for the stage clear song. As far as Commando is concerned, that's everything that the track player needs to know, but there are some extra commands in his later modules that are just too cute to not talk about. We've seen how these single byte pattern playing commands save a lot of memory for repeated musical phrases, which is great, but check out these patterns in Commando. They're essentially duplicates of each other, just pitch shifted, and this happens a lot for bass lines. So to help with that, Rob added some extra codes to the track player to apply these transpositions at runtime instead of baking them into duplicates of the pattern. Whenever one of these is encountered, the track player instructs the pattern player to pitch shift all the notes for that track. Essentially, it's setting a value to add to the frequency index for all subsequent pitch lookups, and that offset will persist until it's replaced by a new one later on in the track. This technique gave the opportunity to save a whole lot of memory, and boy did Rob go to town with this one, bouncing his bass lines absolutely all over the scale. And yes, I know I've said it before, but just to really drive the point home, these are not soundtracker modules. So let me introduce the final demo. This one takes the pattern player code you last heard and makes 3 major changes to it. First, I now play whole tracks. Whenever the pattern player finishes its last note, it calls code in a new track handler to loop the track, to end the song, or to start whichever pattern is next. Second, it will play concurrent tracks. Rob's original code used the 6502's X register to track which voice it was currently targeting, and all of the input and output per track was done through tables indexed by that X register. My code now does the same thing, using the Z80's IX register in the same way. I've allocated a whole bunch of bytes per track to store state variables and information about the target sound channels, and then run my code 3 times over, pointing IX to a different batch of variables each time. And the third change is under the hood. Instead of my player code writing directly to the SSG registers, I'm now having it update a set of virtual SID registers. I then have a separate piece of code watching those registers and driving the SSG. Really, what I'm doing here is splitting the port of Rob's sequencer from the SID emulator, and that should come in handy when I come to move that emulator over to an FM implementation. Lastly, you'll notice that I'm not showing you source code right now. Reason is, at this stage of the project, it's just growing too big too quickly for that to make sense, but I will of course be making the code available online. Head over to the project repo on GitHub, link in the description, and as the project progresses, you'll find a complete set of PDFs with type-in listings for all of the demos throughout the series. What? Okay, time to take a listen. I think the track player makes a big difference from what you saw before. But of course, the downsides from the lack of Byte 2 support aren't going away. I'm being a little selective in what I'm showing you here, but still expect a few rough edges. We'll be fixing those in the next episode, when I'll have Rob's tunes sounding, I think, as good as the SSG's capable of reproducing them. But until then, I'm going to sign off and let the demo play you out. What you're going to hear now will include all 3 of Rob's Commando tunes and a little medley of a few other games that just about get away with not having their Byte 2 emulated. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the music.